In the early morning of June 26, 2023, a convoy of military trucks was moving cautiously along a dusty road near Namsiguia, a town in the province of Bam, Burkina Faso. Hours later, the silence was broken only by smoke shrapnel and a rising death toll. 34 soldiers and local volunteers had fallen in one of the deadliest ambushes the country had seen in years. This was not an isolated attack. It was part of a deepening crisis that had gripped the northern provinces of Burkina Faso. But in Bam, the conflict took on a symbolic weight. This was not merely a battleground. It became a test of whether the state itself could survive. Once a hub of rural life and local trade, Bam had turned into a no-go zone. Entire villages emptied, markets disappeared, schools and health clinics stood abandoned. According to the United Nations, more than 6,000 schools across the country had closed by late 2024. More than 1 million children were out of school, many of them in the Center-Nord region, which includes Bam. The roads were no longer safe. Improvised explosive devices, IEDs, lined the key arteries. Humanitarian convoys were often turned back. Some communities were so isolated they had not received basic supplies in months. Then came the people. By early 2025, over 22,000 Burkinabe had fled their homes, displaced not just by gunfire but by a slow, grinding fear. As one farmer in Kongusi reportedly said, "We do not count days anymore, we count nights survived." But amid the fear, something else was stirring. It started with a speech. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the head of state since 2022, had made a promise. There will be no security without sovereignty, and no sovereignty without sacrifice. What followed was not simply a military response, it was a complete rethinking of how the nation would defend itself. Traoré's government launched a program unlike anything seen before in Burkina Faso. It was not just about deploying troops, it was about transforming every village into a fortress, every citizen into a potential guardian of the Republic. He called it total security through national dignity. And nowhere would this vision be tested more brutally than in Bam. To understand why Traoré's security revolution began here, you must understand what Bam represents. Strategically located in the Center-Nord region, Bam is the artery that links Ouagadougou, the nation's capital, to the embattled northern border zones. Lose Bam, and you sever the state's lifeline to the north. For insurgents, it is the ideal target for the government. It is a red line that must not be crossed, and so Bam became both shield and symbol. Between 2022 and 2025, the province endured repeated assaults from militant groups, particularly JNIM and ISGS. Namsiguia, Borzanga, and Rollo were transformed from towns into frontline outposts. In just 3 years, dozens of attacks killed more than 100 soldiers, volunteers, and civilians in Bam alone. The psychological toll was devastating. Teachers fled health, workers resigned, families moved 3-4 times, only to find that nowhere was truly safe. Yet amidst the chaos, something changed, not overnight but in pulses, in small acts of resistance, in defiant flags waving from rooftops, in young men volunteering for the new defense units, in mothers organizing food for local patrols. And in that shift, Traoré saw something he believed could become a national model. He did not just see a region in crisis, he saw the chance to turn Bam into a fortress, not of concrete, but of commitment. This is the story of how that vision unfolded, and how Bam, once synonymous with retreat, began to stand tall once more. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré assumed power in 2022, he inherited a country that was hemorrhaging territory, trust, and time. The existing security apparatus, centralized, overstretched, and dependent on foreign forces, was failing. Communities were collapsing under pressure, especially in the north. And then came a decision that would change the shape of Burkina Faso's defense strategy. He called it total people's security, not a slogan, a doctrine. The idea was simple but radical. If the state could no longer protect every village, then every village must be empowered to protect itself. This meant redefining the very role of a citizen from passive victim to active defender. Thus began the mass mobilization of civilian volunteers under a new structure, the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, known across the country as the VDP. In late 2022, the government launched a nationwide call for enlistment. Over 9,000 people applied: farmers, traders, students, even retired soldiers. From that pool, 5,000 were selected. They underwent a crash training course just 14 days before being assigned light arms and deployed in their own communities. Critics questioned the model. Was 2 weeks enough? Would arming civilians worsen the conflict? But Traoré's calculus was different. In his view, the greatest threat was not chaos, it was abandonment. And the VDPs, while imperfect, became a force multiplier where the National Army could not reach. In Bam province, the effect was immediate. Villages that had once relied on sparse military patrols now had their own night watch. Locals who once fled in fear began organizing watch posts, rotating shifts, and setting up alarm systems with old cell phones and tin cans. But arming the people was only one half of the equation. The other half was speed. For years, communities attacked by insurgents would wait days, sometimes weeks, for a military response. Traoré decided that had to end. In early 2025, his government formed a new unit, the Rapid Intervention Battalions, or BIR. Unlike regular Army units, the BIR was designed to be lean, mobile, and brutal. Its mandate: hit, hard hit, fast. Within months, 3 battalions were operational in Arbinda, Ugaru, and Diapaga. By mid-2025, analysts estimated that average military response times in the Northern Corridor had decreased by nearly 40%. In the words of one commander, "Before, we reported attacks. Now, we chase them." The shift was not just in tactics, it was in attitude. Traoré also knew that if he asked people to fight, he had to give them the tools to survive. That meant new gear, better transport, and real firepower. In a bold geopolitical move, he cut military ties with France and turned eastward toward Russia, China, and Turkey. The results came fast. Burkina Faso received over 100 armored vehicles, VP-11s, Temsa 2s, and mobile artillery units. New convoys rolled into Center Nord, not with foreign flags but under the red and green of the Burkinabe nation. The rearmament was visible in Bam, where once VDPs had only rifles and grit. They now had cover coordination and backup. Still, war is not just about steel, it is about souls. Traoré's government launched the War Support Fund, a national initiative to finance operations and support the families of fallen fighters. Ministers took pay cuts. Civil servants donated portions of their salaries. In towns like Kongusi, women's cooperatives raised money to buy boots and uniforms for local VDPs. One poster read, "If they protect our land, we will protect their legacy." These were not just acts of charity, they were acts of solidarity. They blurred the line between army and citizen, between home front and front line. It is true that mistakes were made. Some VDP units lacked discipline. Oversight was thin in rural zones. But the overall impact was undeniable. The security net widened, morale rose, and the sense of shared sacrifice deepened. Bam was no longer just surviving. It was reorganizing. From the charred remains of its ambushed convoys, a new security architecture was being built. It was not perfect, it was not polished, but it was Burkinabe from top to bottom, and for Traoré that made all the difference. Not all victories are won with bullets. Some are won with chalkbread and bare hands. In Bam, the war against terror was also a war for the soul of a people, and nowhere was that more evident than in the faces of those who refused to surrender their lives to fear. In October 2025, the Minister of Security, Mahamadou Sana, visited the province. It was not the first high-level visit since the conflict began, but it was the first that felt like a promise. He arrived not with grand speeches but with silence, walking through markets that had only recently reopened, shaking hands with shopkeepers and laying wreaths at the graves of fallen volunteers. Local media broadcast images of children waving flags, chanting songs of courage. One sign read simply, "We are still here." It was a moment. Not the end of war, but the return of presence. The state, the people standing side by side. But beyond the cameras and the ceremony were the quiet stories that truly defined BAM's resistance. In the village of Rollo, a group of 12 VDPs stood their ground for 6 hours against a heavily armed militant column. With ammunition running low, their leader made a final call to detonate their own supply cache rather than surrender the village. 9 died in the explosion, 3 survived with burns and broken limbs. None retreated. Their names were carved into a stone slab by the villagers. Beneath it, someone wrote, "They held the line so others could live elsewhere in Burzanga." A 52-year-old woman, known simply as Mama Bam, opened her home to 7 volunteers cut off from their unit. For nearly 3 months, she fed them, hid them, and prayed with them. When asked why, she said, "Because I want my grandchildren to grow up here, not in a camp." Her story became legend, repeated in schools, markets, and mosques. But resistance did not come only in acts of combat. It came in classrooms. Despite the risks, dozens of teachers returned to duty under the most precarious conditions. In Kongusi, lessons resumed under tarpaulin tents with armed volunteers guarding the perimeter. Children recited poetry to the sound of distant gunfire. During the Day of Excellence celebration held by the Ministry of Security, 47 students and 9 teachers were awarded for bravery and perseverance. A 10-year-old girl honored for attending every class despite threats said into the microphone, "I want to be a teacher too, so our village never forgets how to dream." The symbolism was powerful. Education had become resistance. Literacy became defiance. Women's associations, too, played a pivotal role. In villages across BAM, they formed small cooperatives to fund school lunches, first aid kits, and even boots for VDP units. In Kongusi, one such group called themselves the Mothers of the Resistance. Their slogan, "If they fight for our lives, we feed their strength." These were not charity campaigns. They were declarations of ownership of the land, the future, and the fight. And gradually, something remarkable happened. The people of BAM began to believe again. A recent survey conducted by the African Center for Strategic Studies found that public trust in the military rose from 42% in 2023 to 72% by mid-2025. Across towns and villages, national flags reappeared, not handed out by officials, but stitched by hand and raised by families. It was not that the danger had disappeared. Attacks still happened. Fear still lived in the corners of every decision. But something stronger had taken root. Dignity. BAM had not been saved by a miracle. It had been reclaimed by its people. As Minister Sana said during his visit, "You can give a soldier a weapon, but only a community can give him a reason to use it." And in BAM, reasons were no longer in short supply. Victory in BAM was never going to be defined by a single battle. It would be measured in trends, some subtle, some stark, and when looking at the cold data, the story of recovery becomes more complex but no less inspiring. Between 2022 and 2025, BAM province recorded over 40 significant attacks involving either JNIM or ISGS affiliates. These included ambushes, IEDs, assaults on military outposts, and raids on villages. The bloodiest events, such as the Namsigia ambush of June 2023 and the Burzanga bombing in August 2022, left dozens dead and hundreds traumatized. Yet, by mid-2025, a shift was visible, according to regional conflict monitoring groups like ACAPS and Armed Conflict Location and Event Data. Eklidi, the number of successful militant operations in Center Nord declined slightly between late 2024 and early 2025. Though still high, the rate of civilian displacement decreased by over 50% in March 2025 compared to February. Aid corridors that had been shut down for months were briefly reopened, allowing the World Food Program to deliver rations to Kongusi and Rollo. These gains were fragile but real. On the security side, the establishment of the Rapid Intervention Battalions BIR led to a marked improvement in response time. Local sources estimated that instead of waiting days, communities under attack could now expect a military presence within hours. In some cases, BIR teams arrived within 90 minutes, a drastic change for a region where speed had meant the difference between a village standing or falling. Meanwhile, VDP patrol density increased by nearly 300% between 2023 and 2025 in the Center Nord region. Local night watches, checkpoint systems, and community coordination became more sophisticated. Civilians began to report threats earlier, and some villages formed their own internal alert networks, but not all numbers told a story of hope. According to Human Rights Watch, at least a dozen incidents were recorded between 2024 and 2025 in which state-linked forces, mostly VDPs, were accused of excessive force or reprisal killings. International observers urged greater oversight, calling for the establishment of a civilian military complaint system. And yet, even in critique, one truth stood firm. Burkina Faso was reclaiming initiative imperfectly but deliberately. BAM's turnaround was not just military or emotional, it was geopolitical. The region's centrality in the Sahel corridor gave it newfound significance when Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger announced their collective withdrawal from ECOWAS in January 2024. The three nations had already formed the Liptako-Gourma Charter in September 2023, a joint defense pact. But by mid-2024, that alliance was formalized into the Alliance of Sahel States AEMERS, a confederation of sovereign states united by shared military, diplomatic, and economic interests. Within this triad, BAM was not just a battleground, it was a strategic artery. Supplies to the northern border flowed through it. Communications hubs were anchored in it, and symbolic narratives about dignity resistance and a new African posture were born in it. The international community, long accustomed to leading security efforts in West Africa, began to adjust. After withdrawing its last special forces in early 2023, France adopted a no-interference stance, continuing diplomatic engagement without military footprint. ECO. AS, though disappointed by the departure of its three member states, chose a pragmatic route, maintaining passport recognition, trade ties, and technical cooperation on border management. In essence, they accepted the new map, even if reluctantly. Meanwhile, the United Nations increased its humanitarian coordination in Center Nord agencies like UNICEF and UNHCR, funneled resources into health, schooling, and food distribution. Their presence helped ease civilian suffering and reduce friction between local populations and security actors. But the most controversial shift came in the form of new alliances, with Traoré's government severing French ties. Burkina Faso looked east. It welcomed training missions from Russia's Ministry of Defense and reportedly engaged with Turkey and China for equipment procurement. Though much attention focused on the now restructured Wagner Group renamed Africa Corps, the actual deployment appeared limited to training and logistics, not frontline combat. In BAM, these shifts were less about geopolitics and more about survival. As one local commander said, "We take help from those who give it without chains." Western media had mixed reactions. Outlets like the Financial Times and Associated Press described Traoré's strategy as a pivot toward sovereignty, albeit with caveats. Some African commentators were more direct, labeling him a young Gaddafi without oil, a symbol of African assertion in a post-colonial era. Whether celebrated or criticized, the result was unmistakable. BAM was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was a geopolitical metaphor. a place where national determination collided with global currents. A field where Burkina Faso tested not just its defenses, but its independence. And though the road ahead remains perilous, BAM's transformation offers a lesson to the entire Sahel. Security built from within may be slow, uneven, and painful, but when rooted in dignity, it can outlast any intervention from abroad. 3 years ago, BAM was a place whispered in fear, a land of abandoned homes, silenced schools, and vanishing hope. It stood as a symbol of a country retreating into the shadows of its own borders. Today, it is something else. It is the face of resilience, of villagers who refused to run, of teachers who kept writing on blackboards while bombs fell, of mothers who fed soldiers with nothing but love and grain, of volunteers who stood and fell for a land they refused to lose. BAM did not become peaceful, it became unyielding. And in doing so, it reminded an entire nation and perhaps a continent that security is not merely the absence of war. It is the presence of dignity, of agency, of courage shared among the many, not held by the few. History may forget some of the battles, but it will not forget that when Burkina Faso stood at the edge, BAM refused to fall. If you believe Africa should tell its own story, share this one, because it does not begin in victory, it begins in defiance.